Hi all, welcome back to BRR Knowledge Center. In this today's session, we'll talk about how to create a user for contained database. So in the earlier sessions, if you can look at the earlier sessions, so we have discussed about contained database and the benefits and the limitations of contained database in the SQL Server. So in this session, we'll talk about how to create a user and how to restrict the other databases to not show to the login user. That means how you are going to impose a restriction to the other database objects or other databases in the same SQL Server instance when I'm logging with SQL Server Management Studio. Okay, so as I explained in the earlier videos, a contained database is a database which is isolated from the SQL Server instance and can be easily imported and export into other SQL Server instance with the minimal steps. That means it is purely isolated from other databases. Like if I have a multiple databases in my SQL Server instance, let us say database 1 and database 2 and database 3, and along with these three databases, I have a contained database. So I think I already explained how to create a contained database. I think we basically need to select the type of contained database as partial because it's not fully featured SQL Server database. As like SQL Server database is having some inbuilt SQL Server principles, but this contained database is not fully featured. That's why we need to be configured your SQL Server instance before you create a contained database as partial. I mean, you need to enable the supporting of, the content database of your SQL Server, and then you need to create a content database by selecting type as a partial. By default, it was none. Okay, in this video, we'll just see how to create a user and how it is, isolated from other databases and common security logins in the SQL Server instance. Okay, let me quickly share my screen. I'm just sharing my screen here so that you will have some idea on like how we are going to create the database. So this is my SQL Server, disconnecting it and closing all the other stuff here which I'm having already, and I'm just connecting to my database. This is my database, and by default uh, was so database. I'm just logging with my sub password so that you will see all the databases available in this SQL Server instance. And then we start creating the ContainedDB, and then we create a user. Okay, if you look at this SQL Server instance of mine, I have different databases here. All the databases are not contained databases here. These are fully featured databases where it is having all SQL Server principles. Hence, it is having all no kind of features as like normal databases is having it. But contained database is not like that. As I mentioned, it is not fully featured DB and it is partial. So because it doesn't have SQL Server instance principles. Okay, let me check my SQL Server is configured to support creating of contained database or not. Just right click and choose properties, go to advanced and see enable contained database. This is the property you need to configure it. If you configure this property, then only you are able to create contained database on your SQL Server instance. Okay, I just keep as it is and clicking on OK. And going back to my SQL Server instance, Browse Object Explorer here, selecting these databases and right click and choose a new database. That's what the procedure of creating database here. I'll give my name as ContainedDB, and I'll not disturb anything here because ownership and everything is by default. And I'll just go to the options here. As I mentioned, this contained type must be changed to partial. Then it is going to be considered as a contained database. Okay, because we wanted this database should be isolated from other databases here, and also isolated from the SQL Server instance. That's how it is behaving, so that we can log in without SQL Server credentials. So applications still can access our contained databases independent of the SQL Server instance information, right? So I'm just selecting partial. So if you look at here in the properties, after selection of this contain type as a partial, this section is going to be enabled here, like default full text language, LCID, and default language, and nested triggers enabled, and transform noise words, and two-digit year cutoff. See here, this one. So once you select this contain type and click on OK, now my content database is being created here. So it has all the properties as like normal database is having it, and you can see all the stuff. Okay, and going back here, and if you just click on this, and if you look at any database, select any database here, this is not contained type as a partial. That means it's normal database. You select this contained database which we have created just now. It is showing contained type as partial. That means it is a partial contained DB. That means it has, it doesn't have a fully featured database as like normal database, because it's a partial. That's what it is. No, automatically isolating from my all databases and even SQL Server instance. Now, so I just created my contained database here, and that's fine. So I wanted to create a user here. As I mentioned, if you look at my users here for all the databases, I have these many users along with my star password, bearer and bearer db1, bearer db2, like that. So I don't want to use all these security credentials here. For my contained database, I wanted to create a separate login. That way I'm going to isolate it from other database and logins. So choose security under contained database and users, click on new user and say something. I'll say contained user or contained DB user, and my password is something, and confirm password. And then coming back to here, default language, it is asking you select something and go to default schema, browse it and say access admin, or else you just simply select an owner, DB owner, and click on OK. And click on OK. And again, click on OK. Now my user got configured to this particular DB. If you look at my SQL Server Instance logins, I don't have this user, right? This user only pertaining or belonging to this my contained database. Now, how I'm going to restrict or how I'm going to hide other databases? How do you say that it is purely isolating from other databases? What you're talking about? So now I'm just disconnecting the SQL Server instance, then try to log in again the SQL Server. I'm just disconnecting here. I'll try to connect. So instead of no different user, you use whatever user you created, contained user I created for ContainedDB, and type your password, right? Click on OK. Oops. Right. Contained DB user is something like that, I think. Yeah. So once you give that contained DB user, which the user you have been mapped and created for your contained database, it is going to show you the object explorer like this. If you expand database, you will see only contained database, but not other databases which I have shown you earlier under the same SQL Server instance. Correct? So this is what the benefit of using contained database, and it is enabled since 2012 SQL Server version. And I suggest people who are or who want to hide or put in a restriction or other databases on the same SQL Server instance, I think try this particular contained database feature. Okay. So this contained database feature, as I mentioned, it doesn't have any dependence with SQL Server, other databases logins. It is having its own login, and you just take a backup from here, from the selecting this and take a backup, and you just restore it on your any SQL Server instance, and then you connect it through any application which is going to work independently. Okay. So the main purpose of having this is put in restriction on other databases. Sometimes you may have different databases on the same SQL Server instance. Let us say like my testing department DB or development or prod or UAT or live, all the databases I'm going to deploy on my SQL Server because of wanted to be having a low price model. I don't want to, increase my costing price for the deployment. So if that is the case, people are preferring to deploy all the databases in the same SQL Server on Azure or AWS, and they'll choose this contained database configurations so that if some X client wants to connect to your SQL Server instance, he can see only his databases and not other databases which are already available along with your contained database, right? So the benefit of this database is like generally problem was, if you wanted to move one database to another database or one database to another database of a different SQL Server instance, the problem that occurs when moving databases is that some important information can be available when a database is moved from one instance to another instance. Like an example, credentials, login information is stored within the instance instead of a database level, right? So when it comes to backup restoring, so what it is happening is when you move a non-contained database from one instance to another instance of a SQL server, this login credential information is left behind, so you will not be importing or taking a backup of this stuff. Again, you need to create it. That's what the problem basically when you move one database to another database. So using this contained database, it'll come up with a user which have been created, like this in this case contained database user, and no need a user has to create again a database user once they like he or she import or restore this database on the different SQL Server instance, right? I hope you again coming back. I'm going back to my SQL Server instance and I log in with my password. Then I can see all the databases. Yeah. So I hope you understood the contained database purpose and the user creation and the purpose of having it in SQL Server, right? So thanks for listening to this video. Please subscribe this channel for more videos. Thank you.